Do you believe in zombies? A true story passed down from my great-grandfather. Old Ying was dead. As the day progressed, the old man's body became bloated. His skin and face became very discolored. His mouth could no longer hold that swollen tongue, and so it flopped out on the side of his mouth. His eyes started to bulge out of his skull. His face became a dark hue of green and purple. His belly was becoming so bloated, the vines used to strap him down were cutting into his flesh. The stench of rotting carcasses filled the air, and you could smell him from yards away. The flies, they swarm around him, feasting and laying their eggs in his splitting skin. His funeral lasted 3 days per our tradition. By the end of the 3rd day, he was unrecognizable. His relatives carried his body up the mountain, but his body started to fall apart as bits and pieces of his rotting flesh became loose. His inner organs started to liquefy because black, thick blood was oozing from his mouth and nose. The stench was so bad, the relatives decided to find a quick place to bury him, and so a shallow grave was dug. However, that place he was buried at was only slightly off the trail we took to our fields every day. About a week later, my grandmother and I were coming home from the family fields. The sun was setting and it was getting dark. "Come on, child, hurry home. Let's walk faster," she said to me. And as we were walking down the trail, we were met with a wall of rotten stench that stopped us in our tracks. My grandmother held onto my arm and gestured me to be quiet. Shh. From a distance, we heard a noise as if someone was screaming and crying. The voice was low, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound was coming closer and closer to us, as if it was walking towards us. My grandmother took my arm. Run as fast as you can. Follow me." We ran down the trail towards our village. About 100 yards before we reached the village, there was a body laying in the middle of the trail face down. The body looked as if someone had just recently dug it out of the grave. It was bloated and it smelled putrid. I could see the dark black liquid oozing from the orifices on his head. My grandmother was so afraid. She was trembling. She held my hand, and we were staring at this body in front of us. The body started to twitch. Then it moved its arms and hands very slowly, as if trying to roll over. The thing turned its head and faced us. The eyes were halfway out of his skull, and his swollen flappy tongue flopped out the side of his mouth. It made groaning noises as it started to drag its body towards my grandmother and I. I could see one of the legs was missing and the other leg was barely hanging on. "Shh! Don't make a noise. Just follow me. Run as fast as you can." At this point, the sun was setting down, and darkness would come soon. I remember we ran as fast as we could back to our fields. My grandmother rushed us into the farmhouse. The house was a small place built on the ground. The roof was attached with leaves and had a dirt floor. There was no window. The frame was made out of timber, notched together with a hemp rope, and the walls were made out of vertical wood planks and bamboo. So we secured the door with the grass rope. She told me to climb the ladder onto the loft where we store our supplies and spices. She put me in a large bamboo basket. At this point, it was darkness outside, and I could hear my grandmother praying to the ancestors and my deceased grandfather. It became deadly quiet as time passed. I fell asleep. It must have been about midnight when I was woken up by my grandmother. Pure darkness. She told me to be very quiet. I could hear the sound of someone or something trying to break through the door. The stench of rotting carcasses, it filled my nostrils and I held my breath. We didn't know what to do, and we had no other weapons on us except for a slingshot and my hunting knife, so we stayed as quiet as possible. We listened to that zombie creature attempt to break through the door. Every now and again, it seems to gather enough strength to push its body against the door. Thump, snarl, followed by shuffling and slow movement of the dirt at the doorstep. Luckily, each time, the grass rope held and the door did not open. Once, a second time, one more time, and then we heard the zombie creature shuffle slowly around to the other side of our farmhouse. I can hear it sniff along the walls as if it could smell us. There was no moon out that night, so everything was truly pure darkness in our farmhouse. The creature scratched slowly at the side of the house. After some time, I heard the crackling of bamboo from below. Oh no, we're going to die. Grandma said to me, "Shh, be very quiet. It's breaking through the wall. Be ready to run." I was crying and holding my breath, trying to stay as silent as possible. I can hear the bamboo crack, little by little, as if the zombie was slowly sticking his fingers and hand through the crack and making it bigger and wider. Then we heard screaming and yelling. At first it was far away, and then it came closer. Through the cracks, I saw faint flickers of lights headed our way. The lights and voices came closer and closer. The voices grew louder, and the creature groaned and started to move away from us. It sounded as if it was dragging its body slowly but steadily towards the forest on the opposite side of our farmhouse. I heard someone yell from far away, "Is anyone in there?" My grandmother and I stayed silent as the flickering lights became stronger and closer to us. "Are you human or not?" my grandmother shouted back. "We are humans," the voice said. Then I heard footsteps running to the door. "Mom, is that you in there? Open the door!" In my life, I have never felt the relief I felt that day hearing my father's voice. That night, my father and the village man came and took us home. He told me he came searching for us because we didn't come home, and he found large piles of smeared blood on the trail that led to our farm. He was afraid that the human poachers that he had heard about were coming after my grandmother and I. So he gathered the men from the village and they followed the blood trail to us. The next day, the village men went to Mr. Ying's grave, and there lay a shallow, empty grave.
"Help! Help!" I screamed furiously, wiping my face. The slime all over me. I'm hanging upside down. The creature with the red eyes moved closer. Its claws slowly cut into my skin on my thigh. I could smell the stench of rotten meat and feel the warmth of my blood as it dripped down my leg. "Wake up, Jake! Hey, Jake, wake up!" my roommate shouted as he shook me awake. I finally woke up. Sweat dripped down my back. I felt a pressure lifting off my chest as I gasped for air. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Okay, just another night of this nightmare, I thought to myself. I had been having the same nightmare for the past couple weeks. It always started out the same. I am walking down an unknown hallway in a dormitory. As if in a horror movie, the lights would flicker out. The hallway lights are dimming. Next, would hear an ominous sound of a little boy calling my name. The little boy wore a blue hat and a tan school uniform. The little boy would then run down the hall towards me really fast and disappear right before reaching me. So close each time, and still I flinched only to find myself hung upside down in a dark room. First the stench of rotten meat, next the heavy breathing, Then I find myself facing a creature with red eyes and sharp claws. I can't make out the creature's face, but I can feel that he is huge. The dream will always end right before the creature finishes digging his claws into my flesh. As I kept experiencing this nightmare, things started to feel more and more real. I started to wake up with unexplained scratches on my arm and chest. That time, I woke up with a burning sensation on my thigh. "Dude, look at your leg," my roommate said in terror. I looked down and saw a long red scratch on my thigh. This time, whatever it was had actually broken the skin on my thigh. Horrified, I quickly got up and wiped my thigh with my hands. I wanted to make sure I wasn't still dreaming. The pain faded away soon after I woke up, but the scratch remained. That Friday morning, I went to class half asleep. I must have dozed off. I heard my professor calling my name. The class let out a quiet laugh. I lifted my head up, embarrassed. I opened my textbook, buried my face in it, and stayed silent. After class, my professor told me to meet him in his office. I followed him. After gesturing for me to sit down, he asked if there was something going on with me. He had noticed I was looking more tired lately. "You seem more withdrawn and quiet. Is everything okay?" he asked. I told him, yeah, everything is okay. I couldn't tell him about my nightmares. He would have thought I was going crazy. After a short conversation about my declining performance and quality of work in that class, I left his office and continued the rest of my day. Later that night, a few buddies and my roommate wanted to go out to the bar. I declined. I had an important essay to finish, so I stayed back in my dorm by myself. At about 2 a.m., I heard a knock on my door. I looked and it was my roommate. I opened the door and let him in. He didn't say much and sat on the bed. I returned to my desk and continued to work on my essay, my back turned towards him. "How was the bar?" I asked. There was no response. I smiled, thinking he had passed out. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door and the laughter of my drunken buddies. I went to open the door and there was my roommate, passed out drunk. My buddies held him like a wounded comrade. I felt my guts sink. My throat dried up as I slowly turned around and looked at my room. No one was there. "Watcha looking for?" one of them asked jokingly. "A ghost?" They laughed as they brought my roommate in and threw him on his bed. They patted me on the back as they were leaving, making jokes about the look on my face. "You must have seen a ghost," one said. "Nah, he just needs to get laid," said another. I sat there staring at my roommate. I swore I would punch him if he was trying to play a prank on me. He is the only other person who knew about my nightmares. He just laid there, passed out like a hibernating bear. I closed my laptop and went to bed. I stared at him all night to make sure it was really him. Later that week, I was heading home late one night from my part-time job at the gas station down the road. I didn't have a car at the time, so I walked. It must have been about midnight. As I was walking down the dark road, I noticed the silhouette of a man standing by the building. Suddenly, I heard a growl from behind me. I quickly looked but didn't see anyone. I quickened my pace and started to dash for the entrance of the dorm. It felt like something had tripped me. I found myself hitting the ground. My body is tumbling over. I looked up and saw the silhouette of the man standing over me. "Jake," he whispered. "Remember me?" His eyes glowed red. Terrified, I crawled away frantically before finding the strength to get up and run away. When I reached my dorm room, my roommate asked what had happened. I couldn't tell him. I was trying to catch my breath, trying not to shit myself. After that, I moved out of that dorm room and moved in with one of my buddies at his apartment. The dreams are less frequent now, and I haven't had any more encounters with that man. I avoided dark roads and hallways for a long time. I still go to bed every night afraid that I will see that man when I wake up. Let me share a truly scary paranormal experience with you today. I still get chills talking about it. The hair on my arm still stands whenever I mention this experience. In 2001, my family moved away from the inner city. My father bought a home on the outskirts of town. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom ranch home that he bought from a widow whose husband had recently died during a fishing trip in Canada. Shortly after we moved then, we started to hear footsteps at night and odd sounds throughout the house. At first we thought it was the furnace or the pipes, but eventually my father ruled that out too. I had 3 brothers and 1 sister. I was 16 and the oldest at the time. We used to play hide and seek quite a bit. There weren't other kids our age for miles, and so we spent more time in this home than outside. Anyhow, our basement was separated into 3 rooms. One room was an open space that was directly in front of the staircase. The other side of the basement was separated into 2 rooms. One room was for storage. It was about the size of a large walk-in closet. The other room was made into a living area, and that's where we put our furniture and sofa. We often played in that second living room down there because it had carpeting. I remember one particular day when my brothers and sister and I were playing in the basement. We had this idea of playing hide and seek in the dark. So we turned off all the lights. I was the one the seeker and my siblings were hiding. I counted to 10 and I turned around to start looking for them in the basement. As I started walking around in the dark, looking for my brother and sisters, I would shout out Marco and they would reply Polo. We had played this game many times before in the basement with the lights off. I made my way into the second living room and I heard a child whispering. I smiled and thought that it was my sister. Then I saw a shadow move across the wall into the corner behind the couch. I giggled and started walking in that direction, thinking that I was about to find my first victim. I walked over to the corner behind the couch and I said, "Boo, I found you." And I figured it up facing me. I could feel it was the size of a little child. It did not say anything or make a single sound. At that moment, I heard my sister laughing at me from outside the room. I turned to look in her direction in the dark. At that point, I was a bit freaked out. I felt chills and the hair of my arm stood up. Then I looked back to find the figure in front of me had disappeared. I quickly ran out of that second living room and turned on all the lights. To my surprise, I found my brother and sisters all huddled together behind the exercise equipment in the open space of our basement. I was freaked out, and I decided to quit playing this game. I took my younger brothers and sister upstairs, and we watched television instead for the rest of the night. One night, he came to my parents and told them that a little boy was peeping through the closet doors. My parents didn't believe him, and they thought his imagination was just going wild. He would describe the boy as a 9-year-old child with no hair. He never said that the child looked scary. He just said the child would pop his head out of the closet door or around the corner from time to time. One hot summer night, our air conditioner unit had broken down. Our house was really hot, and so we set up a window unit and we all slept in the living room. It was the only room in the house that had air conditioning at that time. We laid on the ground with our head towards the door and our feet towards the kitchen. To my right was the TV and the window where the air conditioning unit was placed. The sofa was perpendicular to the front door. It was a relatively quiet night until my brother started having a nosebleed. He came up to me and told me his nose was bleeding. He was about 6 years old at the time. I took him to the bathroom and cleaned him up, and we stuffed Kleenex up his nose. I noticed his nose was a bit pink, but not from the blood. It looked like he had bumped it. I asked him, and he told me that the little boy pinched his nose and caused it to bleed. I asked him, "What little boy are you talking about?" He replied, "The one in my closet." I was already a bit spooked at that time upon hearing those words. I escorted him back to the living room and returned on the TV. I was 16 at that time, and my parents were at work. It was about 10 o'clock, and my father usually got home around 12:30 at night. I felt a bit more secure in knowing that he would be home in about 2 hours. I picked up the phone and called my boyfriend to see if he was coming over after work. He told me he will be working a late shift until about 11 o'clock, and then he was going to head home because he was tired. As I was talking to him, I heard a loud scratch go across the carpet. I thought the sound came from my brother. He was still awake and sitting on the floor. I continued to talk to my boyfriend. Then I heard that same sound again. This time I knew for sure it wasn't my brother because he was sitting next to me. My 2 other brothers and my sister was asleep at that time. I started feeling an eerie feeling in the air, a change in pressure that I can't quite explain, a feeling that made you want to leave the room. I told my boyfriend on the phone that I didn't feel safe and felt creeped out by what I heard. He reassured me that everything was okay and he would try to get off early to visit. Because it was 10 p.m., I told him not worry and I would call him if anything happened. We hung up the phone. At about 11 p.m., my 6-year-old brother fell asleep on my lap. I was sitting on the sofa when I started to doze off. I had just closed my eyes when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. I opened my eyes to see a shadow figure standing by the dining room table. Suddenly, my brother started to make gurgling noises next to me. It sounded as if he was underwater and couldn't breathe. I turned around to see a little boy sitting on his chest. The little boy had no hair, was bald, and had dark black skin. Its eyes were all white. It sat on my brother's chest like a frog. That thing was staring at me with an emotionless face. Its arm extended with the hands covering my brother's mouth and eyes. I felt a fear so deep I couldn't explain it in words. My body froze and I felt as if I lost my voice. Time stood still as I was staring into the face of this thing. Then I remember something that my father had told me. He said if I'm ever faced with something beyond the human realm, have courage and be brave. This will almost always give me the upper hand. I gathered all my courage and I picked up that little boy and threw him into the TV. I distinctly remember that the 30-inch box TV moved and the screen cracked. I still remember the sound the thing made as it hit the TV. It sounded similar to a screeching cat mix with growling sounds. Then it vanished into thin air. My 6-year-old brother started crying and I looked at him. He was laying on the sofa with his hands covering his face. His nose was bleeding profusely. I picked up the phone, but it wouldn't connect. At this point, I'm freaking out and crying. I thought, what the fuck was that? And what the hell am I going to do? As I saw the blood overflow from his hands. I took my t-shirt off. I used it as a towel, trying to stop his nose from bleeding. I held his head down to stop the blood from going down the back of his throat. I tried to prevent him from gagging and vomiting. I applied pressure to the bridge of his nose. I held him in my arms and I rocked him back and forth while crying, trying to calm both of us down. At this point, I'm hearing rattling sounds coming from the basement. I started praying to God for protection to get rid of whatever was causing all this. I looked up to the ceiling as if I was looking up to the heavens. I remember just shouting whatever came to my mind as I prayed to God for protection and to help my brother's nose stop bleeding. As soon as said amen, the phone rang and it was my boyfriend. He told me that he was on his way to see us. I could hear the concern in his voice. He told me he had an ominous feeling at work. He had heard my voice calling his name. Then he saw my reflection in the window and it freaked him out. So he lied to his boss that there was a family emergency, and he left. Within 5 minutes, he was at my house. We looked around and didn't see anything. Then I remembered that I had thrown that little boy into the TV. When I went to look at the TV, there was nothing broken and everything was still intact. It had not moved. My boyfriend stayed with us that night until my dad came home. We told my dad what happened and showed him my t-shirt that was soaked in blood. By that time, the commotion had woken my other siblings. They were crying because they were afraid of the rattling noises. My brother's bloody nose had also stopped. My father and my boyfriend stayed in the living room with us that night. We left all the lights on and there were no further incidents. In the morning, I heard him talking to my mother about this. They were talking in their rooms, so I could only make out a few things that were said. I heard my mother voice her concerns about this home. She had personally experienced some paranormal activity as well. Later, my father would confess to seeing apparitions that looked like us when he was home alone. With nowhere to go, we continued to live in that house for 5 more years. During those years, we experienced more paranormal activities. Even though all this occurred 22 years ago, it feels like yesterday. I still have nightmares about that place. Because of this feeling, I will share the rest of these memories another time. Today, let's get ready to explore the darkest corners of the human imagination. Encounters that will leave you questioning reality itself. I'll see you in the shadows.
My father's village had a woman named Mary, who was very selfish to say the least. She will not share anything with anyone, or let alone borrow from her. There were times when she would lend things out to her favorite people, only to return later that night and cause a scene in order to get her stuff back. And if someone borrowed her items for more than one day, she would yell at them, "Don't you know I need these items too?" Screaming at their face and pointing at their forehead as if they had stolen from her. Her selfishness was known throughout the village, and she became known as the Old Witch. She lived with her son named Mark and her daughter-in-law Judy in a small two-story home at the edge of our village. If Mark or Judy touched her stuff, they would be scolded and would be screamed at, and she would go around town accusing them of stealing. All her children became afraid of touching anything that belonged to her, even the dishes and the pots. Mary did not get along with anyone and eventually moved to live on her own. Her family built her a small bedroom home on the other side of the field, and there Mary would have a full view of all her properties and her kids' houses. And then she started hoarding items such as chairs, gardening tools, junk, and furniture. It filled her home and her yard, and she refused to have anyone maintain the grounds of her home. Eventually, the weeds and the grass took over, and her home took on this creepy energy felt by all those who walked by. She spent her day gardening and fixing the fence around the perimeter of her home so no one would step on her property. And even though she acted this way, she still expected her kids to bring her food and all her necessities daily. Oh, Mary was a mean old lady. When the neighborhood kids would go on her property, she would yell out the window, "What are you doing here, kids? Are your parents dead? Why aren't they watching you? Get out of here." The neighborhood kids were afraid to go near her property. Even if her own grandkids were over, they walked on eggshells. "I'll cut your fingers off if you touch my stuff," she would say to them. If her food was not cooked properly, she would mumble and grumble underneath her breath. Then she would go and dramatically get down on her knees, looking at the sky, shouting. She would scream with her hands in the air to Grandpa because she thought Grandpa was in heaven looking down on her. She would curse and tell Grandpa how horrible the kids were and they made her this horrible food. When Mary didn't get her ways, she would wear the clothing meant for the people who were dead, and she would lay in the hallway or the doorway of her kids' house and tell them, "This is a reminder of what I look like when I die because of you." My uncle would kindly ask her to get out, and he would try to remedy whatever was making her upset. She would tell him that she knows everybody hates her and nobody will come to her funeral. And that's why she decided to wear the funeral clothing now, to remind all her kids of what will happen. When her children argued with her and tried to take off those clothings that she wore, she would fight them and scratch them and bite them. Even the elders of the village came to speak to her about this, and she continued her habits and continued to put on clothing meant for dead people whenever she was upset. As time went on, Mary got weaker and older, and as she laid on her deathbed, she kept speaking to her husband. Even though the husband died many years before, she was telling him to wait. "Wait, let me gather some more items before you go. Hang on, I'm coming with you." And that night, the dogs were barking and growling at random things, at least things that humans couldn't see. And the atmosphere was scary and chilly. "Hang on, Oh, just wait. Wait until those stupid kids leave. Then come here, come and sit with me. Mary would say to whomever she was seeing, and no one saw anyone there. And so she would gesture for this thing to come and sit next to her. When the family members asked Mary who she was talking to, she kept telling them that she was talking to her husband. My husband is waiting for me out there. Now move, get out of the way. If you don't move, he can't come in. Wait. He's standing right behind you. Oh, hello. She was pointing to the doorway, but no one was there. It was just darkness. Her own kids tried to reassure her, but there was no one. There was no one there. And she continued to talk to people that she could see standing in the doorway. Everybody was starting to get creeped out, and a lot of the relatives that came, they left. About 4 days later, Mary died. Her 3 daughters and son-in-laws came to visit her and say their last goodbye, after which the 3 of them split up all of Mary's personal items and took it back home with them. The family took Mary's body up to a remote area in the mountain and buried her there. Her kids returned back to the village and continued their daily lives. About 4 months after Mary passed away, things started to get creepy and weird. It was as if Mary herself had come back. The oldest daughter, her name was June. June thought that it would be a sign of respect, a way to remember her mother, and also because she missed her mother. And so she decided to put her mother's clothing in a bamboo basket and set it on the foot of her bed. One night, while her husband was attending another funeral at a neighbor's house, June saw the basket start to shake. She sat there watching the basket move for about 15 seconds, and then it stopped. And a little while later, it would do the same thing again. She went over to the basket, lifted up the lid, and there was nothing underneath it. And so June went back and sat by the fireplace. A little while later, she heard the noise again and looked towards the basket. And that's when she saw the lid slowly opening and closing, opening and closing. She started to get goosebumps and chills. The thought of her mother coming back to haunt her, it did cross her mind. And she tried not to be scared as she watched the basket slowly move from time to time. Because it was the middle of the night in her village, she was too afraid to run to her neighbor's home to find her husband. And so she just sat there, praying, clutching onto her yarn and her blanket, watching this basket as it slowly moved. Shortly after that, the basket stopped, and she heard a noise. She heard whispers, and the lid of the basket started to open about 3 inches, and a black, dark, slime-like manifestation peeked out of the basket. And it looked like it saw her, so it closed again. And it did that one more time. Except this time, it was a hand, a dark, black, slimy hand, coming out from inside the basket, as if it was trying to quietly crawl out of the basket. At this point, June was so scared, she just took off running. She barged through the door, found her husband, and demanded that he come back. You gotta hurry up, you gotta come back and see, she said. I saw something, I don't know what it is, but I saw something. I'm too scared, you need to come back with me in the house right now. The kids are still in the house. What's the matter? Asked her husband. She told him that there was a black, creepy hand coming out of the baskets at the foot of her bed. And so the husband ran back home with her, and they checked around the house, looked at the basket, but there was nothing there. "Are you sure you saw something?" asked the husband as he looked around the house. I really did. I really did. It was black. It was coming out of this basket. It saw me and then it went back in," she said. June's husband came up with the conclusion that maybe his wife was just crazy. Okay, he says. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the basket and I'm going to put it all the way over here." And so he threw the basket into the corner of their courtyard. And he said to her, "Go to bed, June. Don't think too much." A few days later, as June was making lunch, and she noticed that basket rattling from the corner of her eyes as she was looking out the window into the courtyard. And this time it wouldn't stop. Little by little, shimmying its way closer and closer to the house. And June saw it again. The big black fog slime thing, this time with eyes peeking through the basket, opening the lid, just looking at her. Kind of like a child when they play hide and go seek and they're looking at you and you see them. So she hurried and she screamed for her husband and he came running in. Oh my god, the thing's moving again. It's moving again. Oh my gosh, you have to look," she told her husband. Her husband decided to look and stare at the basket that was now in the middle of the courtyard. After a few minutes, the basket moved, and the black fog creature peeked through from the basket again. At this point, the husband was so scared. He didn't want to be defeated by this thing that was manifesting in home, so he grabs one of the gardening tools and he charges towards the basket, shouting, "Get the hell out of here! You don't belong here! What are you doing in my house? Leave us alone!" The husband went and opened up the basket, ready to fight whatever was in there, and he saw a big black snake. At that moment, the snake tried to bite the husband, and the husband smacked it with the gardening tool and sent the snake flying across, and that black snake slithered away behind it. The husband went to look at the wall, look around the house, but he couldn't find anything, absolutely no sign of a snake anywhere. One week, their two sons decided to stay home by themselves. And so the younger one wanted to get up and go use the bathroom. And that's when he saw a white figure standing in the hallways. He watched the apparition flow back and forth, slowly down the hallway, going through a wall and disappearing. He woke up his brother, and they turned on their oil lamp, and they looked around, but they didn't see anything in the hallway. They're both so freaked out that they packed their stuff and ran over to their friend's house and slept over there instead. A few weeks later, as June was laying in bed, she heard the voice of her mother mumbling from the other side of the wall. She woke up her husband and they both listened, but they couldn't make out what the voice was saying to them. The voice, it just kept mumbling and whispering all night long, and neither one of them got any sleep. The next day, they were so tired. They were feeling exhausted. They were starting to feel overwhelmed. Afraid, the husband and June decided to return to a shaman to seek answers as to why they were expecting this. The old shaman told them that this was just your mother who died, coming back to visit you and reclaim what belongs to her. What are we gonna do? Asked June. How do we stop this? The shaman told her to give a spiritual offering to your mother and return her items, and things should quiet down for a few days. And so June and her husband gave a little spiritual offering to their mother, and things did quiet down for a few days. About a month later, back at Mark and Judy's home, their grandson had come home late one night. He saw a dark figure sitting by the fireplace, rocking back and forth, sitting pretzel leg style, hunched over with a black dress looking into the fireplace with her back to him. "Hey, Grandma! Hey!" he said. "Grandma!" I guess she can't hear me. And he tried to talk to that person sitting there, but it didn't respond back. It just continued to sit, hunched over with her back to him, and he couldn't see her face. And that thing, it stood up and walked towards the back door, hunched over with long, messy hair. It never turned to look at them, but it dragged its dark outfit towards the kitchen. About a week later, Judy heard some noises coming from the backyard shed one evening, and as she peered through the window, she saw a person, a lady hunched over, looking through her shed. The doors were open. She thought, I thought I locked that. And as she got closer, she saw the lady was wearing the clothes that you would put on dead people. You know, people when they die and you're going to bury them. And that person was rummaging through the shed looking for something. And so Judy couldn't see the face. But it was not anyone that she would recognize. She went and said to her husband, "Hey, hurry up, someone's going through our shed. It might be a thief, it might be a homeless person, come on." So her husband took the flashlight out and walked towards her shed. "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here on my property?" The figure stopped and started to sway back and forth, as if walking backwards towards him. In that moment, he realized this was not a human being. It scared him to the core, and he ran back inside and locked the door. The next morning, Mark and Judy were so scared they decided to go talk to the village shaman. And the shaman told them that it was just their mother coming back to look for their items. And so Mark took all the items in his house and all the items in the shed that belonged to his mother and dumped all of that stuff at the grave. Told his mom, "Mom, I brought all your stuff for you today, so please leave us alone." And at that moment, all the courage that he had built up left his body, and he sat there trembling in fright. He was scared as he slowly walked away from his mother's grave. As he was walking away, he was pretty sure that he heard the sound of the soil moving, of the things being moved around, as if someone was looking to make sure that everything was there. And he took off running. He just left the gravesite, didn't even look back once. Now going back to June's house, a couple of nights after that incident at Mark's home, June's daughter was getting ready for bed when something caught her attention. At first, it looked like the blanket had shifted slightly. But as she looked closer, between the edge of her bed and the wall were little skinny fingers, dark blue fingers, coming out from between the crack of her bed and the wall, as if someone was starting to crawl out. June's daughter was so shaken by the experience that she refused to go back into her room, and so she slept on the floor in her parents' room. As June's husband was getting ready to go to sleep, he was locking the doors when he noticed something. Someone opened the window. So he walked over there. He knew for sure that he had closed that window, but it was open again. So curious and a little puzzled, he started walking towards the window and then stopped right in his track because something was coming through the window. There was a long black arm reaching from the window as if going towards the gardening tool that was set right below it. The arm, slimy and slim, dark with long fingers and nails, reached from outside the window inside the home, trying to grab at the gardening tools. And it looked as if the arm just wasn't strong enough to pull the tool through the window. because it kept losing its grasp. Thinking that it was just a thief, he ran outside, went around the house to the window where the person was at, but he didn't see anyone. It was completely empty. So he looked at the window where the arm was coming through, and he saw something black smeared against the side of the wall window. At first he wasn't sure what it was, and then he touched it and noticed it was very slimy. It smelled like rotten flesh and old blood. Ugh! He quickly wiped his hand on his clothing, ran inside, washed his hand, took off his clothes, threw it into the garbage. The next morning, he decided that he would bring it back to the grave. And he got there, and about 15 feet away, he just tossed it on the grave and took off running back home. When he got home, all of his energy and all of his courage and the life of him seemed to have been sucked dry, and he sat there in his chair, unable to even move. Later that day, an older couple from the neighborhood was walking home from the fields when they walked past Mary's grave. They saw the gardening tool and seen that it was still in pretty good shape. So they thought they could just borrow it. We'll just use it for a couple days and return it. No one would notice, grumbled the husband. And surely after taking the item, the couple began to experience paranormal activities. One night, when the husband was reaching into the drawers to look for his money, he felt as if someone was grabbing into his arm, and he could feel the pressure from the finger as it squeezed his arm, and his arm became more numb and heavier in number and weak, and no matter what he did, he couldn't move his arm out of the drawer. He tried and tried, and he tried to scream, but it was as if someone was holding onto his voice box, and he couldn't make a single sound. And finally, whatever that thing was, it let go of his arm. And he ran out of his room and told his wife. That wife, she didn't believe in that stuff, so she shrugged it off. Later that night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, as they were settling down in bed, the couple heard whispers coming from the head of the bed. They couldn't make out what the whisper was saying to them, but it gave them chills and was creepy enough that they couldn't sleep because they were sure something was going to pop out of the wall. The wife called out, "Who's there? Hello? Who's there?" But there was no reply. This continued for several nights, and every time it would get more and more scary, more and more creepy. Whatever was haunting them started to scrape against the wall, caused the animals around their homes to become restless, and the dogs were even scared. One night, the man had a dream that Mary came to visit him. He saw Mary sitting at the dining room table. He went and said, "Mary," and she turned around. Her face was rotten with flesh peeling off, and blood came oozing out of her eyes. She scolded him as he fell backwards. She got on top and was staring him at the face, telling him, "Give me back my stuff," and she demanded it. He could smell her foul, rotten stench. He woke up, and his room smelled like rotten flesh. He was so afraid he woke up his wife, explained his dream to her, and at that moment they heard loud banging on the window. He got down on his knees and he prayed, "Please, please, I will return it to you. I'm sorry, please." Early that morning, he took the gardening tool back to Mary's grave. As he was leaving, he heard a voice insult him from beyond the gravestone, and he took off running. The hauntings from Mary continued, causing everyone in the village to leave. Now that village stands in the middle of nowhere, overgrown by shrubs and trees and grass. Some even say that the spirit of Mary still roams the area, going after anyone who steps on her property.